Here's something most Americans don't understand about their own geography. Back in 1848, through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico was forced to cede 55% of its territory to the United States. We're talking about over 525,000 square miles. That's California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado, Wyoming, Kansas, and Oklahoma. Mexico received $15 million in compensation, which sounds significant until you realize what was actually lost. Now, I want you to think about this carefully because it matters to what's happening today. This wasn't just a land transfer, it was a fundamental reshaping of North American power dynamics that still reverberates through every aspect of US-Mexico relations. The question isn't whether Mexico will recover these territories through military means or formal territorial claims. That's not how modern geopolitics works. The real question is far more sophisticated and far more likely to manifest in our lifetime. We're seeing demographic shifts, economic integration through nearshoring, cultural influence expanding northward, and a complete transformation of what we consider the American Southwest. When you combine this with weakening US institutional capacity, the rise of multipolarity, and Mexico's strategic position between the declining American empire and an ascending multipolar world order, you begin to see that territorial recovery doesn't require armies. It requires time, demographics, and the inevitable correction that follows every imperial overreach. This is the conversation nobody in Washington wants to have, but it's the reality unfolding right beneath the surface of current events. So let me walk you through what's actually happening here, because this is where it gets interesting and where most analysis completely misses the mark. We're not talking about Mexico sending troops across the Rio Grande or filing lawsuits at The Hague demanding the return of California. That's not how power transitions work in the 21st century. What we're witnessing is something far more subtle, far more organic, and ultimately far more irreversible than any military campaign could ever achieve. We're watching the slow-motion reconquista of the American Southwest, and it's happening through demographics, economics, and the simple reality that borders on maps don't always reflect the cultural and economic realities on the ground. Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers tell a story that should make every American sit up and pay attention, regardless of their political persuasion. As of 2024, California's Latino population stands at approximately 40.8% of the total state population, while Texas is at 40.3%, Arizona at 32.1%, and New Mexico leads at 49.1%. Think about that for a moment. New Mexico, a state that was literally carved out of Mexican territory in 1848, is now approaching a majority Latino population, but here's what makes this even more significant. These aren't just immigration numbers anymore. The Latino-eligible voter population has increased by 153% since 2000, from 14.3 million to a projected 36.2 million in November 2024. We're talking about a demographic shift that is fundamentally altering the political landscape of states that were once Mexican territory. And this isn't slowing down, it's accelerating. The Hispanic population accounted for just under 71% of the overall growth of the United States population between 2022 and 2023, driven primarily by births, not immigration. Let that sink in. This is a natural demographic transition, not something that can be reversed by border walls or immigration policy changes. Now, I want you to understand something crucial here. When we talk about territorial recovery, we're not talking about sovereignty in the traditional sense of changing flags and government structures. We're talking about something much more fundamental. Who lives there, who shapes the culture, who controls the economic activity, and ultimately who determines the political direction. In New Mexico, Latinos don't just make up half the population, they're becoming the dominant cultural and economic force. The same process is underway throughout the Southwest. In California, no race or ethnic group constitutes a majority anymore, with 40% Latino, 34% white, 16% Asian American or Pacific Islander. This is a state where the traditional Anglo majority has already dissolved into a plurality. What we are seeing is not invasion, it's demographic transformation, and it's happening within the framework of American democracy itself. But demographics alone don't tell the whole story. We need to talk about what's happening economically, because this is where Mexico's strategic position becomes absolutely critical to understanding where we're headed. Trade between the United States and Mexico reached $72.5 billion in September 2024, an increase of 8% from the previous year, and Mexico has been America's largest trading partner for 9 consecutive months. Read that again. Mexico has surpassed China as America's #1 trading partner. This didn't happen by accident. This is the result of a phenomenon called nearshoring, and it's fundamentally restructuring the economic relationship between the United States and Mexico in ways that have profound geopolitical implications. What is nearshoring? It's the process of companies moving manufacturing and production closer to their primary markets, and for American companies, that means moving operations from Asia to Mexico. The shift in global trade patterns, especially in the context of the US-China trade war and the China Plus One diversification strategy, has positioned Mexico as a crucial investment hub within North America. We're not just talking about maquiladora assembly plants anymore. We're talking about sophisticated manufacturing in automotive, aerospace, electronics, and medical devices. We're talking about supply chains that are being fundamentally rewired to run through Mexico rather than across the Pacific. And here's the thing that should concern anyone thinking about American economic sovereignty. This makes the United States increasingly dependent on Mexico for critical goods and components. Let me give you some concrete examples of what this looks like on the ground. Tesla has announced plans for a factory in Nuevo León. Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers, including BYD and Jetor, are investing billions in Mexican manufacturing facilities, and Chinese battery maker CATL is considering a multi-billion-dollar battery factory in Mexico. You see what's happening here? Mexico isn't just becoming America's factory, it's becoming the gateway through which Chinese manufacturing enters the North American market under the cover of USMCA trade agreements. The United States-Mexico-Canada agreement was supposed to protect American manufacturing. Instead, it's being used as a mechanism for Chinese companies to access American consumers while avoiding tariffs. Mexico has positioned itself as the essential middleman in a new global trading system, and that gives it enormous leverage. Now let's talk about what this means for those territories that Mexico ceded in 1848. The economic integration we're witnessing isn't creating a stronger American Southwest tied to Washington and Wall Street. It's creating a regional economy that increasingly looks south toward Mexico City and Monterrey. Manufacturing jobs that used to be in California are now in Tijuana. Supply chains that used to terminate in Texas now originate in Nuevo León. The economic gravity is shifting, and with it comes political and cultural influence. When your economy depends on Mexico, when your workforce is increasingly Mexican-American, when your culture is bilingual and bicultural, what does sovereignty even mean anymore? You're looking at a form of economic integration that makes formal territorial boundaries increasingly irrelevant. And here's where we need to talk about something that makes Washington extremely uncomfortable: the role of the United States in its own decline. The American empire is not being defeated by external enemies, it's collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions and failures. The US military interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq revealed the limits of Western hegemony, draining financial resources and contributing to widespread instability. We're watching an empire that spent trillions of dollars trying to control the Middle East while neglecting its own infrastructure, education system, and industrial base. The United States outsourced its manufacturing to China, created massive trade deficits, and then acted surprised when China used those profits to build the Belt and Road Initiative and challenge American hegemony. This isn't a story of American strength being overcome by foreign competition. This is a story of imperial overreach, hubris, and the inevitable decline that follows when you ignore basic economic realities in favor of military adventurism. The world is moving toward multipolarity, and this is not a theoretical concept anymore. In 2024, China produced 32% of global manufacturing output, while the US accounted for just 16%, and BRICS, the China-led economic bloc, continues expanding with major economies joining. The unipolar moment is over. The United States can no longer dictate terms to the rest of the world. Countries like Mexico are increasingly able to pursue their own interests without fear of American retaliation because they have alternatives. China offers investment without political conditions. Russia offers energy partnerships. Brazil offers agricultural trade. The Global South is creating its own institutions, its own trade networks, its own currency arrangements. The American dollar's dominance is being challenged. The World Bank and IMF are losing their monopoly on development financing. This is a fundamental restructuring of global power, and Mexico is positioning itself brilliantly to benefit from this transition. Think about Mexico's strategic position for a moment. It borders the United States, the declining hegemon with enormous consumer markets. It has access to both the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. It has a young, growing population at a time when the United States is aging rapidly. It has natural resources, including significant oil reserves. It's a member of trade agreements that give it preferential access to North American markets. And most importantly, it has something that the United States desperately needs but can no longer produce domestically at competitive prices: manufacturing capacity. Mexico isn't asking for the Southwest back. It doesn't need to. Economic integration and demographic change are accomplishing what no military campaign ever could. Let's talk about what this looks like on the ground in terms of cultural influence, because this is where the transformation becomes undeniable. Drive through Los Angeles, Phoenix, Albuquerque, San Antonio, and you're not in Anglo-America anymore. The signs are in Spanish, the radio plays Mexican music, the restaurants serve authentic Mexican cuisine. The cultural celebrations are Mexican Independence Day and Dia de los Muertos, not just American holidays. This isn't immigrants failing to assimilate. This is a demographic majority asserting its cultural identity within the American system. The United States has become the second country with the most Spanish speakers in the world, with just over 57.4 million Spanish speakers. Spanish isn't a foreign language in the Southwest anymore. It's increasingly the primary language of commerce, culture, and daily life. Now, here's where this gets really interesting from a geopolitical standpoint. The American political establishment is completely unprepared for what's coming. They still think in terms of controlling immigration flows and building walls, as if you can reverse a demographic tsunami with border enforcement. But the transformation is already baked into the population structure. Hispanics are projected to account for 14.7% of all eligible voters in November 2024, up from just 7.4% in 2000. In another generation, Latinos will be the dominant voting bloc throughout the Southwest. They will elect governors, senators, members of Congress who reflect their interests and cultural values, and those interests are not going to align with traditional American foreign policy priorities. They're going to look south toward economic integration with Mexico and Latin America. They're going to support policies that facilitate cross-border family connections, trade, and cultural exchange. The implications for American foreign policy are staggering. Imagine a scenario 20 or 30 years from now where California, Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico have Latino governors and majority Latino state legislatures. Do you think those states are going to support aggressive policies toward Mexico? Do you think they're going to back military interventions in Latin America? Do you think they're going to maintain the Monroe Doctrine mentality that has characterized American policy toward the hemisphere for over a century? Of course not. You're looking at a fundamental realignment of American interests, driven from the bottom up by demographic change rather than from the top down by Washington policymakers. And this brings us to the question of imperial decline and what happens when empires lose control of their peripheries. History shows us that empires don't usually collapse suddenly. They fragment gradually as peripheral regions reassert their autonomy. The Soviet Union didn't lose the Baltics and Central Asia through military defeat. It lost them because it could no longer maintain political and economic control. The British Empire didn't lose India and Africa through conquest. It lost them because the costs of maintaining control exceeded the benefits. We're seeing the same pattern with the American empire. The United States is overextended militarily, burdened with unsustainable debt, politically divided, and increasingly unable to project power effectively. We're in a period where there is no longer the international order that governed geopolitics for the last several decades, with a normalization of conflict and large countries ignoring norms. The Southwest is expensive to maintain. It requires massive infrastructure investment, water resources that are increasingly scarce, social services for a growing population, and economic development in regions that have been left behind by deindustrialization. Washington can barely maintain infrastructure in the Northeast. How is it going to fund the Southwest's needs while also maintaining a global military empire? The answer is that it can't. And when federal support declines, when states have to fend for themselves economically, they naturally look to their nearest economic partners. For the Southwest, that partner is Mexico. Let me paint you a picture of where this could go. We're already seeing sanctuary cities throughout the Southwest that refuse to cooperate with federal immigration enforcement. We're seeing states like California enacting their own foreign policy by signing climate agreements with other countries. We're seeing economic integration that bypasses federal control. Now extend that trend forward. Imagine a scenario where water crises in the Southwest force greater cooperation with Mexico on river management. Imagine trade agreements that are effectively negotiated state to state rather than nation to nation. Imagine cultural and educational exchanges that create a generation of young people in the Southwest who identify more with Latin American culture than with East Coast American culture. You don't need a formal change in sovereignty for territorial recovery to be effectively complete. The genius of what's happening is that it's not being orchestrated by the Mexican government. It's not a conspiracy. It's an organic process driven by economics, demographics, and the basic human desire to be with your own people and culture. Millions of individual decisions, where to live, what language to speak, what businesses to patronize, how to vote, are collectively creating a transformation that no government policy can reverse. This is bottom-up change, and it's unstoppable because it's rooted in fundamental realities rather than political decisions. Now, let's address the obvious question. Is this good or bad? Well, that depends on your perspective. If you're invested in maintaining American dominance and the territorial integrity of the United States as currently constituted, this is obviously a nightmare scenario. You're watching the slow-motion dissolution of national cohesion in a strategically critical region. But if you're Mexican or Mexican-American, this represents a kind of historical justice. The territories that were taken by force in 1848 are being reclaimed through peaceful democratic means. The people who were always there, who never left, are simply reasserting their majority status and cultural dominance. And if you're looking at this from a global perspective, concerned about multipolarity and the end of American hegemony, this is just one more indicator that the unipolar moment is over and that we're returning to a more balanced international system. Here's what I want you to understand. This isn't about moral judgments or taking sides. This is about recognizing patterns and understanding where they lead. The demographic trajectory is clear. The economic integration is accelerating. The cultural transformation is already well advanced. The geopolitical shift toward multipolarity is undeniable. These trends are not going to reverse. They're going to intensify, and the logical endpoint is a Southwest that is culturally, economically, and increasingly politically oriented toward Mexico rather than toward Washington. Whether you call that territorial recovery, or regional autonomy, or cultural reclamation, doesn't really matter. The effect is the same. The question isn't whether Mexico will recover these territories in some formal legal sense. The question is, when will Americans wake up and realize that the recovery has already happened? When will they recognize that the Southwest is already becoming post-American in meaningful ways? And most importantly, what will be the consequences when this realization finally hits the mainstream political consciousness? Because that's when things could get really interesting and potentially quite dangerous. Declining empires don't usually accept their losses gracefully. They fight back, often irrationally, often destructively. We could see attempts to suppress Latino political power, to impose English-only laws, to restrict voting rights, to crack down on economic integration with Mexico. But these would be desperate rearguard actions against an inevitable historical process. The truth is that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was never fully legitimate in the eyes of many Mexicans and Mexican Americans. It was a forced cession extracted through military conquest. And while international law recognizes such treaties, history has a way of correcting injustices over time, not through war or formal renegotiation, but through the slow accumulation of demographic and economic facts on the ground. The people who live in California, Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico are increasingly of Mexican descent. They speak Spanish. They maintain cultural connections to Mexico. They benefit economically from integration with Mexico. At what point does the formal sovereignty claimed by Washington become a fiction that everyone politely ignores while living a different reality? This is the conversation that terrifies the American establishment because they have no good answers. They can't reverse demographic trends without authoritarian measures that would destroy American democracy. They can't compete economically with Mexico's manufacturing advantages without massive reinvestment in industrial policy that neither political party is willing to fund. They can't maintain cultural dominance when they're no longer the majority population. And they can't reverse multipolarity because that would require a level of global power that the United States simply doesn't possess anymore. So instead, they pretend none of this is happening. They focus on quarterly GDP numbers and stock market performance and convince themselves that American dominance is eternal. But reality doesn't care about delusions. The next 20 to 30 years are going to be fascinating to watch. We're going to see this process accelerate. We're going to see the first majority Latino states elect governors and senators who fundamentally challenge Washington's priorities. We're going to see economic integration deepen to the point where supply chains and labor markets operate as if the border doesn't exist. We're going to see cultural institutions in the Southwest that are functionally Mexican in orientation regardless of what flag flies over the courthouse. And we're going to see the American political system struggle to adapt to a reality where a significant portion of the country no longer identifies primarily as American in the traditional sense. This is not a crisis that can be managed with policy tweaks. This is a fundamental transformation of American society and sovereignty. And Mexico doesn't have to do anything except be patient and let history take its course.